Good afternoon. We're delighted with this big crowd. It's fantastic. We are here to honor Manfred Bahmann and his newly published autobiography, When All Hell Breaks Loose. And the procedure is that we will have something from each of three panelists up here, and then after that we'll have a little bit from Manfred at the end. We will start with Dr. Peter Pettit, who is the director of the Institute for Jewish Christian Understanding at Muhlenberg College. Peter's to my right. They've agreed that I should go second. I am Bill Jennings. Most of you know me well, residents of Luther Crest. And then Mary Ann Bauman. We will get a true account of Manfred's life from her.
All of the errata at collision.
Yeah, what we left out. What do you think?
All that's been left out of the book, we would hear. So, and then we will turn it over to Manfred. Peter?
Thank you, Bill. Good afternoon, and hello to many friends, long-term and brand new. Good to be with you today. And a remarkable honor to be able to be here to honor Manfred, to appreciate what he has shared with us in his book, his memoir, and maybe to do a little bit of roasting. I don't know. It really is a delight to have this invitation to be here. And Manfred, I have to start out by saying especially many thanks for your very kind mention in the book, and for the very generous portrait that you have afforded me in the book. No, he doesn't mention you, Bill. I noticed that. I have to say, after reading the whole book, or as I made my way through the book, one of the things that struck me most, if I wanted to characterize Manfred Bahmann as I met him in this book, is this: I got the sense that we have among us the Forrest Gump of the religious world. If you remember the movie Forrest Gump, Forrest showed up at every important moment in the era in which he lived. And Manfred takes us through he was here for all of this. He was there for all of this. The bombing of Dresden in 1945, probably the high point of the Protestant ecumenical movement at the Evanston Assembly of the World Council of Churches in 1954, the birth of Latin American Liberation Theology at Medellin, Colombia in 1968, and then tellingly, while he was in West Berlin and chaired the Stadtbau, or was on the board of the Stadtbau, which was the organization that was most significantly involved in preserving West Berlin's architectural heritage and providing housing for its most marginal residents. So there he was again in West Berlin, although he does tell us pointedly he wasn't there when the wall fell. But that's the exception, because there he was again in Manhattan on 9/11. What's fascinating about the story of this peripatetic journey is that Manfred has the humility and is willing to risk the vulnerability to suggest to us that he traveled so widely around the world that because perhaps when he was 15 and lived through the bombing of Dresden, he became a victim of PTSD, post-traumatic stress, which was not a diagnosable illness in those days, hardly treatable in the post-war era. And yet Manfred's willing to consider the possibility that this is, in a sense, what set him off on such a fascinating journey. But whatever it was, what's most striking about the story we read is what a confident faith and self-assurance Manfred took with him throughout his life and his ministry. I was reminded in reading of his approach to all the varied places that he was and challenges that he faced. I was reminded of an adage which now appears as the tagline on Jim Hendersheet's emails from a young 15-year-old friend who says, and I didn't copy it exactly, Jim, but roughly it says, love what you have until the life you want is the one that you have. It seems to me that your insights that Christ transcends every culture and all circumstances, and your deeply shaped spirituality grounded in a relationality, that the one thing we can be sure of about human life is that we will be in relationships of I and thou, and that if we lose track of that human relationality, as you say, disaster follows. It's those underpinnings that, as I read it, that help to account in someone who may for decades have been dealing with the effects of PTSD, to account for a posture which in South America, in California, in Ohio, in Connecticut, in West Virginia, in West Berlin, did I miss any? In all those places and circumstances could be characterized by a remarkable openness and a generosity of spirit, particularly for a parish pastor, a generosity to those who were not a part of the church. It seems to me part of the key to this is something that I didn't count them, but I'm guessing there have to be at least, what do you think, Bill? 350 references to the risen Christ in a 320-page book? The risen Christ, our risen Lord, the risen Christ. There's no question where the focus and the center of your faith and spirituality are. It's characterized exquisitely, page 258, when you say that in Kreuzberg 36, you wanted to erect a signal of Christ's resurrection as the hallmark of your, not the hallmark, as the vehicle of your ministry. And yet I have to ask, here's my first question. You say that Jesus Christ Superstar, with its very human Jesus and no resurrection at the end of the story, is one of the most powerful portrayals of the Christian story that you know. You contrast Marianne's episcopally shaped Easter faith with your dour German Lutheran Good Friday theology of the cross.
Theologia Crucis.
Yeah, Theologia Crucis, exactly, because both of us know Latin so well. But theology of the cross, a Jesus story without resurrection, a very human Jesus, and yet the Christ you hold to is a risen Christ. Can you say more about that? I was just fascinated by it as I read through. But not yet. You'll have your time. And out of that comes an emphasis on grace, very clearly an emphasis on grace. You name it clearly on page 39 as you emerge from Dresden and the war, and you make clear that it is this amazing sense of forgiveness and grace, that God is a God of mercy. But you don't tell us where you got it. It just grows slowly. I'm afraid, Manfred, that maybe those confirmation classes that you say didn't do anything actually took. I'm not sure. But I'm curious about that as well. A couple of quick things I won't dwell on. You came out of a horrible war experience, and fundamentally, I think, could be described as a bit of a liberal pacifist. And yet, chapter 8, where you get your theological training, you talk about God, you title it God's Armor. You quote Paul, putting on the whole armor of God for your ministry. And yes, we've studied together a few times over recent years, and I know you can be a pretty combative guy. When you talk about your ministries and the things that you ran up against, there's a combative spirit. I'm curious about the relationship between your experience of war and your horror at war, and yet this sense that you still are dressed in God's armor, and you certainly know how to take the battle to an opponent when you need to, or a partner. Your deep immersion in liberation theology and experience of it. All I can say is we need to have lunch. I've got a lot to learn. I have a ton of questions, and I really look forward to a deeper conversation. Medellin, the working group. You speak with such joy and pleasure about being named the secretary of the working group, this native German speaker who'd been teaching or working in America for 10 or 15 years, who's now in South America with 4 months of intensive Spanish language training, and you're invited to be the secretary of the working group at Medellin. I hate to break it to you, I think you just got snookered on that one. And you make the clear point that in every society and in the contemporary America of the last 20 years that you have known, you can spot the pseudo-religious ideology of war hawks because you have the smell of it still in your nose from Nazi ideology and culture. And I just wonder, can liberals also fall prey to pseudo-religious ideology in a similar way? Those are the quick questions. Let me come back to my last, more substantive one. You talk about Jews and Judaism. You preached in a synagogue when you were, 23? 22 at Rammstein? 26? I don't know. As a kid.
24.
24. Okay. You preached in a synagogue on Cain and Abel and tied it to the German killing of Jewish brothers and sisters. By the end of the book, I have to say that the 2 or 3 paragraph summary that you offer of an understanding of Jews and Christians as parallel peoples of God, so to say, is one of the most satisfying and meaningful summaries of that view that I can remember reading anywhere. I want to steal one of your phrases when you say that because Jews have been approached by God through grace in the covenant with Abraham, they can live lives less encumbered than Christians who daily wrestle with the cycle of sin and forgiveness. Beautiful phrase. And yet, you do say, page 53, that God revealed God's self more fully and more convincingly in Jesus Christ than God had done, or presumably has done, in Israel. I'm curious about the more. Just asking. Let me be clear. These are all wonderful points to explore with Manfred for years to come, God willing. These are not criticisms. They are questions. They are points of stimulation that this really wonderful memoir and reflection provides for us. I am deeply grateful, Manfred, for your ministry and for your reflections on your ministry in this book and as we have opportunity to work together. I am, frankly, not only humbled, but profoundly inspired by the courage and the commitment of your ministry in so many places down through the years. I am, frankly, also very curious now to read Eloise Schindler's West Berlin Journal and whatever other memoirs she might write, and not to overstep my deep respect and appreciation by an improper use of German pronouns, but to cite your beloved scripture, sehr gut. Du bist ein tüchtiger und treuer Diener. Dankeschön.
Last November, I read a biography of needs to be closer. Last November, I read a biography of Benjamin Franklin and thought, wow, what a man, what a challenging life. Immediately after that, I read the autobiography of Manfred Bahmann. Whoa, wow, what a man, what a challenging life. So I decided to make a comparison. Ben and Manfred, some similarities. Both of them had trouble with their fathers. Ben Franklin's father was a strict Puritan and ran a strict home in Boston. And Ben bristled at that and ran away from home as a teenager. Ended up in Philadelphia seeking a clearer air to breathe. Both Ben and Manfred had troubles with their sons. Ben Franklin's son was governor of the colony of New Jersey and a strong follower of the king. On the opposite side of the Civil War, of the Revolutionary War from his father. And they never really reconciled. Manfred gets along rather well with his son, my understanding. On the other hand, it is clear from the book, Manfred is disappointed in his son because his son turned away from Manfred's beloved Lutheran church and of all things became a practicing Buddhist. Both of these men moved far afield from their homeland, moved into foreign countries, and in the process had to learn foreign languages. For over 10 years, Ben Franklin spent his famous time in Paris, and in the process had to master French. Manfred, coming to America, had to master English with a German accent, and outdoing Ben Franklin, he went to Latin America and he learned Spanish and had to master Spanish. And at the end, both of these men, now that Manfred has published his biography, both of these men published interesting autobiographies. But it's not so much the similarities between the two men that I'm interested in. As I compare the two, I see the major differences, and that's what makes this comparison interesting. Ben Franklin was a son of the Enlightenment. He was forever optimistic. He was enthused by what was going on in the world. He was excited by the new science that was developing, of which he took part, and by explorations, and by the latest books that would come out. He was a great humanist and optimistic that the future is bright for human beings. That gave rise really to the birth of democracy, to put government back in our hands. Ben Franklin was so enthusiastic about human beings, he thought human beings could be perfect. Ben had little use for Christianity. He rejected totally the Christian idea of sin. In fact, he developed a series of 12 virtues and worked hard on making himself perfect through the use of these virtues. Something that would sound absurd to Lutherans and Presbyterians. Manfred was born in a different world. A world of two disastrous world wars, a world of nuclear arms race in which human beings almost destroy themselves, a world of a hot Cold War in which he held the pastorate in the shadow of the infamous Berlin Wall in Berlin. In many ways, it was a world which produced despair and anxiety rather than confidence and optimism, kind of the opposite of Benjamin Franklin's world. The influential view of Manfred's youth was what was known as dialectical theology. In the United States, we read some of the same books. Those of you who were in seminary at the same time that I was, you read some of the books that Manfred read. Dialectical theology in the States was known generally as neo-orthodoxy. It is a reaction against the optimism, the false optimism of the Enlightenment. A reaction against, really, the kind of view that Benjamin Franklin presented. It is a view that takes human sin very seriously and takes human weakness very seriously and attempts to deal with the despair that often comes out of human failure. The bombing of Manfred's beloved city of Dresden occurred in 1945. This was a pivotal event in Manfred's life. He discusses it at the beginning of his book, at the end of his book, and it is the title of his book, All Hell Breaks Loose. Wave after wave of British and American bombers rained bombs upon the defenseless city, a city that did not have much in the way of air defenses, and a city which had not been bombed before because it was not important for the war effort. The bombs rained down upon this city. We don't know how many people were killed. Many things have been written about the bombing of Dresden, and the estimate usually is 100,000 people. That is the number that Manfred uses. It's a wonder that Manfred and his mother and his sister escaped from that chaos. For a boy of 15, this was truly an apocalypse. Now, as I was reading the book, I noticed in the later part of his life, he happens upon another apocalypse that Peter discusses. It so happens he is in Manhattan at 9/11. And he wanders around the city in this chaos. He smells the smoke of the fallen buildings. He sees and talks to the people that are in great despair about what to do and what is going to happen to the city. It is interesting that he wanders around and ends up in Washington Square, not very far from the ground zero. And in Washington Square, he spends some time discussing this situation with some university students. It is interesting that he points out, I've been in this situation before. There's a similarity between what is happening here in our city in Manhattan and Dresden. Now, Manfred, I find that interesting. In fact, that section of the book, to me, is the most interesting part of the book, primarily because it's so recent and so personal. Dresden is somewhat distant for me, but 9/11 is close. And I find it interesting to compare 9/11 and the bombing of Dresden. Why do you make this comparison? And I think that's certainly worth a significant article. It may well be you are the only living human being that experienced personally, up close and personal, the bombing of Dresden and the bombing of the World Trade Centers. And I think we need a little bit more from you about that. Non-combatant immunity, in other words, when you fight, don't attack civilians, has for centuries been one of the rules of warfare of civilized nations. It has been a central theme in Christian just war theory for centuries, which has come to influence international law. We're familiar with battlefields such as Gettysburg and such as the First World War killing fields of France. Back in those days, you had army against army. You did not attack civilians. You honored non-combatant immunity. The Nazi Germans changed that overnight when the Germans bombed the cities of England, what we call the Blitz in 1940. The Germans did not attack the British Army or the British Navy. The Germans attacked the British cities. And that is a new kind of warfare. It's not interesting. You probably do not know this, Manfred, but I recall reading years ago, this was before America entered the war. The British, in retaliation, began to bomb German cities. But the Germans had very good air defenses for their cities. And the Germans began to shoot down the British planes. So the British decided, we'll bomb at night, and they don't see the planes well at night. The United States sent a secret memo protesting night bombing because the United States government said, you bomb at night, you cannot see where the bombs are going to fall. And you're bombing at night and you're killing civilians. You need to bomb and attack military targets. Now, very soon, the United States was a partner to the British, and we were in the war, and the air war escalated rather quickly. The weapon of choice very quickly became the incendiary bomb, the very large incendiary bomb. So the bombs that the British and the Americans dropped were intended to set fire to the cities and burn them to the ground, and in the process killing as many people as possible. The bombing of Dresden came in early 1945. The end of the war was only weeks away. Germany, the Nazi army, had been pretty well defeated. There was almost no German air force anymore. So the bombers had free reign over the German territory. Early 1945, 100,000 people killed. At the end of the war, when the war was almost over with. Now, there's been extensive material written about the bombing of Dresden. It's the most famous and notorious bombing episode in all of the Second World War. The theology that Manfred and I grew up with, we read in our younger years, recognized the great significance of sin in human affairs. And it rejects the false optimism of a man like Benjamin Franklin. Along the same wavelength, though, this theology says that we must be especially sensitive to self-righteous good people and to self-righteous good nations. When a good nation, such as America or England, makes a mistake, it is often a doozy. The guilt of Germany during the Second World War was certainly mammoth. But there was guilt on the Allied side as well. America was guilty. The British were guilty. In any war, there is no such thing as an innocent party. Dresden should never have been bombed. Manfred argues that, and I think most of us would support Manfred and agree.
Thank you to both of you. It has brought so many thoughts to me. I have 1,000 things I would love to tell you, but I would like you to ask questions when the time comes so I know what it is that you are really interested in. I have known Manfred for 61 years. We met on the Grips home on the boat in 1954, described in the book, and the spark was instantaneous. Ever since, we've been in love, I guess. What was he like at that time? We talk about it a little bit in the book. He was an anarchist. He was against authority, but he was very bright, and he was curious. And that's, I think, what his professors saw in him and why he was basically given the chance to come to the United States. Of course, he knew English. That was important. But people saw something in him already in high school when he was pretty much on the way to being a kind of punk kid before there were punk kids. And his teacher, Alex Niederstenbuch, said, Bahmann, read Romans. Paul had the same questions and anxieties as you do. And for some reason, he clicked into that. You could very well not have clicked into St. Paul, but he did. And I think that's the thing that happened there. And where perhaps he opened himself to the Holy Spirit, which I believe is a real presence, and which I think has been a presence in his life and a guidance all the way through. Even though he had rejected the values of civilization, family, and culture, because he saw how they can, that original sin can enter those two very important values that we all hold dear. I think what's enabled him to carry on and take hold, first of all, was a very, very strong love of a mother, an unconditional love by his mother. No matter what he did, all the way through, she was a rock. And I think that is very important for any child, and that is missing in many families today, and what's going on in our society. Someone who unconditionally says, you are wonderful, without spoiling him. She didn't spoil him. She was really something. And I think that was, now I have a senior moment. But anyway, she was really, the other thing that happened, that sustained him, but did not keep him from rejecting family when they were, as refugees, were turned away from two aunts because of the furniture or because one was having an affair with a German officer and didn't want them in the house. And that cracked that. And in culture, what can culture descend to if it is considered the highest value, which it was in Nazi Germany, higher even than Christianity? Everything was subsumed to the culture, and which has made him very wary of cultural hubris. In this country especially, that's one of the things where perhaps the PTSD comes out. I remember when our nephew had his Eagle Scout ritual, and he asked Manfred to be his sponsor. Manfred had never had anything to do with the Boy Scouts, of course, growing up in Germany, but he said, sure, I'll come along. This was in New York. And when he came back from that ceremony, he was practically shaking with, maybe it was PTSD, the rituals, the things that were said, the flags, the uniforms, took him back to Hitler Youth, because Hitler took all of these symbols from the British Boy Scouts. And there you see, these things will never go away. Things will trigger them. But in any case, he has, I think, his faith, his belief in original sin. You always have to be watchful. He always sits with his back to the door. Facing the door when we go anywhere. There's this thing there. You always have to be watchful. I think that this has been a strain, along with the mercy that St. Paul reveals for all of us in the Bible. There are a number of strains which have made him what he is, and it has been fascinating to be on the journey with him and to watch him make decisions. At any of these points in our lives together, he could have made another choice. And he made the risky choice. And with enthusiasm. It wasn't, oh boy, what's going to happen? But yes, I can do this. So if you have any questions then later, anything, I'll be glad to tell you. He can take it.
We have a special guest today, a friend of Manfred's, friend of some of the rest of us as well, the Bishop of the Northeast Synod of the Lutheran Church, Sam Zeiser. So Sam, we understand that you are a new grandfather. So we congratulate you. Well, most of us know how that feels.
Twins.
Thank you. Yes, and I have photographs, so don't leave. Just a few things I would like to say as part of this wonderful opportunity to gain insights into someone whom I believe is a considerable force in the life of the Lutheran Church. And let me try to give you a sense of why I believe that's the case. First, I want to say that the similarity that I see, Manfred, between you and perhaps someone else of some distinction is the Apostle Paul. I could not help throughout the book but be aware of the way in which the conversion of Paul with that bright light that knocked him off a horse was really not unlike the bright lights that exploded over the city of Dresden that pushed you in a very interesting way, very deeply into the essentials of the Christian faith, and really provided much of the rudder that directed you from one kind of ministry to another. And so I think not only the writings of Paul are significant in giving dimension to your ministry, but I think what we know as the story of the conversion of Paul also has something in common with who you are as a Lutheran pastor. I've had the good fortune to have my life intersect with Manfred's on a couple of occasions. And I can't tell you how privileged I feel to have had one of those occasions to be standing with Manfred on the block on which he lived in the city of Dresden. And to be able to stand there and have him point up and down the block and described who lived in which of the houses that was destroyed by the bombs. And to have him so graphically and yet so humbly talk about how neighbors he knew were incinerated because they sought refuge in their basement. It was perhaps one of the most powerful spiritual experiences of my life. And to have read about it in the book really was in some ways a lot calmer. And I want to thank you publicly, Manfred, for delving into whatever deep emotions involved in that description, standing in the middle of the block in which you lived and in which so many of your neighbors died, to give me a sense of the breadth of personal experience that is involved in a person of such deep faith as yourself. It has given me an awareness of how important it is for our pastors today and our candidates for the ministry to be able to confront and express the deep and abiding challenges to life that are very real in their young experiences. And so I think that the trip that we made to Dresden for the joyous and celebratory Kirchentag was really given its greatest dimension standing in the middle of the block in the neighborhood where your life was transformed. I also had the opportunity, not with Manfred, but on another trip to one of our companion synods, to be on the grounds of the seminary where he taught in Argentina, Jose Sepas. Manfred is still remembered there with fondness. And at the time I was there, I really wasn't deeply aware of you. We hadn't really had very much contact prior to that. I only really knew that you were a pastor of this synod. But what was significant about that, and which I think helps me understand where Manfred comes from in such a very unique pastoral way, is, as he described in the book, the dichotomy between existence within the walls of the seminary and the everyday lives of the people who lived around it. The fact that Manfred was able to grasp the great difference in the lifestyles between the one he was living and the lifestyle lived by so many thousands of people living so close by was, I think, very real and gave shape to your ministry thereafter, because I think the visual comparison day in and day out must have been profound, and is not the kind of thing that all of us have the opportunity to experience. We live something of a homogenized life, I think. Not all of us, to be sure, but I think by and large, our lives are pretty straightforward and homogeneous. You have helped us, Manfred, to appreciate how important it is to be able to step out of that as people of faith. And I think that's a challenge most of us, and I include myself, are probably not able to take. And through your book, you make it possible for a lot of us to be exposed to the kind of world that I think is portrayed in the life and ministry of Jesus a couple thousand years ago. You have been able in the 20th and 21st centuries to make that very real to this church, to the people of this church, and for that we are indebted to you. Finally, in this regard, one other intersection is the little rural community of Albrightsville. I enjoyed as much as anything your description of your ministry there. And the reason for that is that Albrightsville sits about 10 miles north of my hometown, Jim Thorpe. And many of the people who live in Albrightsville relate to the community of Jim Thorpe. Many of the children I went to school with were from Albrightsville. And there is a manner in which I feel as if you gave me an opportunity to see the place of my upbringing through the eyes of someone with special capacities to see, and not only see, but also to be able to express. And so from a very personal point of view, I'm indebted to you for helping me to define where it is that I come from. And I trust you in that because I stood with you in your hometown. So you've got integrity there. Just a few very quick remarks. As a bishop, I am always interested in the dynamics of a call that one of our pastors experiences. And I'm just fascinated by two things. First of all, the way in which despair defines your professional leadership. It doesn't overwhelm it, but it has given you a motivation to discover what it means to be loved by a gracious God. And I can't think of a better qualification for a pastor in a congregation than someone who is driven to discover what it means to be loved by God out of a personal sense of despair. The other things is just a variety of the circumstances. You were in urban and rural settings. You were with the scholarly and the unlettered. You were with the wealthy and the poor. You were with the establishment and with the disenfranchised. And the cultural diversity that surrounds your life story is remarkable. North America, South America, Northern Europe. I wish you had had the opportunity to serve the church in either Japan or Vietnam. And I say that because of the firestorms that defined those nations, namely the dropping of the atomic bomb in Japan and the napalm bombs that were dropped in Vietnam. It would be instructive to hear what it was like for you to relate to folks in those places. Finally, I want to, before the finally, the style of this book is majestic. It is majestic because it reads exactly the way you express yourself verbally. This is a wonderful manifestation of your ability to communicate. Finally, really finally, I want to read the passage that for me defines you. It's on the top of page 152. actually begins on the bottom of page 151. Far from giving up my Lutheran heritage, these few months in Cuernavaca filled me with an even more sincere appreciation of what Martin Luther had accomplished. But they also gave me a new appreciation for the church that expelled him as a heretic. And here's what I love. How do I explain this contradiction? Yes, there are divisive church doctrines, clashes of teachings and opinions, mutually opposing approaches and probings. But beyond our human divisions, there is the presence of the crucified and risen Christ in both. Christ, time and again, calls all believers into communion with himself and then with one another. I congratulate you on a life lived so beautifully in the context of those words.
Manfred, it's yours. Do you want to respond now, or do you want to have comments or questions from the audience?
Well, I'll say a few words right now, but I am looking at the clock. We have maybe 40 minutes at the most before 4 o'clock, and then we really have to break, because of dinner and all kinds of other stuff, and I am very much interested in what you people, I'm very grateful to each one of you coming out to this event here today. And I want you to have a chance to say something. Just 2 or 3 reactions. One thing that is very interesting is that you really zeroed in on the Dresden bombing. And the Dresden bombing was, of course, of magnificent importance for me. No question about it. But as to my, to use the term that the bishop used, conversion, my conversion was rooted not so much in the war event of the destruction of Dresden and the totally senseless killing of all those defenseless civilians there in the end days of the war. I mean, that was all part of war as far as I was concerned. Part of this nonsense of war. But the real reason for my conversion was the collapse of all the values. It wasn't that the cities were destroyed. It wasn't that all those people had been killed. But all the values, everything that I had held up and held on to was destroyed after the war when the full truth about the Nazis came out. That is where I was really thrown into complete despair and despondency. And I felt, well, what is the point of living anymore if life is only bombing people into shit? That's how I put it. And at that time, I was in my late teens, I formed a poem. And I'm sorry I didn't get it into the book, although it probably should have gotten in there, I don't know. It's just a 2-liner. The only poem that I ever made, and I don't plan to do another one. And it runs in German. Halt im Gedächtnis Jesus Christ, weil alles andere großer Scheißdreck ist. Keep in your mind Jesus Christ, because everything else is nothing but bullshit. That was where things started to turn for me. And no, it was not neo-orthodoxy. Neo-orthodoxy is an American invention which is senseless and doesn't express anything. But it was this total despair that there was no real value to life, which influenced us then also, not just only me, but all kinds of people after the war in Europe through the philosophy of existentialism. Sartre, many French philosophers and others, and then also, of course, Søren Kierkegaard, where we felt all the various good points that you can bring up won't convince me anymore. I have seen evil, naked evil. Forget about your values. Forget about your families and all the other things that you constantly praise and hold so high. That is where it really turned. And it was really, as I think Peter pointed it out, I had the good luck of having some good teachers and some here and there good pastors who pointed us in the right direction. Yeah? And I then immersed myself in the scripture. And I would say, well, what convinced me, what converted me? The Holy Spirit. Yeah, I'm really a Lutheran all the way through. So, but that's enough of me. We have maybe a little bit over 30 minutes.
I have to say something to that. That's why he needed an Episcopalian in his life.
Why don't you take the questions, Manfred? Paul has the microphone. Who wishes to talk?
Yeah.
One moment.
On March 22nd, you will be coming up to Scranton with Mary Ann to give the last lecture within a Bonhoeffer seminar, the last lecture of the 5th year. At the close of that, it'll be 5 years done. Not everybody wants to come to Scranton. And for that reason, I applaud you and Mary Ann. I don't know what it is. Anyhow, one of the things I've always wanted to ask and never got quite to it at the seminars and at the planning meetings in between there and here, a favorite theme of yours, Christians and Jews, Jews and Christians, a tale of two testaments. That sense of testament is better worded covenants, right? Two covenants, old and new, first and second. And I would be interested for you, because I think it would be illuminating to all of us to know why, well, that idea of a testament is really in the spirit of last will and testament. That's how it's used. And so Christians say the second testament, the New Testament, is the superseding document. You don't feel that way, do you?
No. It's not two testaments. I find in the Bible many different covenants. Testament is actually a covenant. No? And in the Bible there are a whole series of different covenants. No? Not just only Old and New Testament. And why am I sticking with this? Because it is through these covenants that, in my opinion, God interacted with the human race. Yeah. And the one thing that I did not answer was that I think Peter Pettit said that, in my opinion, the revelation of God in Christ is more convincing. And you said, well, what is the more? I don't know. I cannot explain the more convincing. It is more convincing to me. But I cannot say that it is more convincing to anyone here. We have some wonderful Jews here. There is Jerry Mantel. Well, and there are other Jews here. And for them, it would be different, and that's fine. So, but that's my answer to you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm British. I have a few questions. Manfred, I'm apologizing. I'm sorry you endured the bombing. I'm sure it was, obviously a major issue for you. My father flew Lancasters and Spitfires in World War II. He started in North Africa in the army. When the RAF ran out of men, he wanted to fly. I come from a very small village in England. In that village, we did not send people that could not get jobs. The families sent often their only child, their only son. My grandmother wore black. My grandmother wore black, I think all the time I ever knew her. Most families lost their only child, their only son. You said they bombed the cities. Where we made our aircraft and bombs was to the west of where I lived. So the bombers came over my village, and the buzz bombs would drop on my village. So we would listen. I was a very, very small child. And we would listen for those, we would have to listen for those bombs coming over. And still at night, I have a trigger. If I hear a plane at night, I immediately think it's a bomb. I still have that trigger. During the day, no. So I understand what you went through. And I would like to say the RAF, I really sort of object to any comments about the Bomber Command. We were fighting for our lives. There was nowhere for the British to go. We would have fought to the last person. Only quote, it was felt cowards had the money or the ability to go to America. If the Germans had landed in England, we would have fought to the last person. And as a small child, my only thought was, I knew what the Germans would do to the adults, but I did not know what they would do to the children. So I don't think the British did not, as far as I know, intend to kill civilians. But we did everything we could to survive. It was survival. So, and the RAF Bomber Command had the greatest losses of any civilian population, and any more than the infantry. I believe of every 100 men, 55 were lost. And you know, if you want to talk to the orphans and widows of the bomber pilots, very, very few came back. So I just want to show, and those men had to go out every few days over on the raids. It was very, very difficult. So being a bomber pilot was absolutely no fun. For there was two sides. And have you ever been into a Lancaster? If you would like to, Reading Air Show sometimes brings the Lancaster bomber planes down. And those planes, they are very small. They are not pressurized. They are the most unbelievable planes that you would fly in.
Yeah.
They are unbelievable.
Very good. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your contribution. I think that it's very important that what you said was said. I never felt any hardship or any hatred or any great hostility over against any of the pilots that were throwing the bombs on us. I, in Medellin, as a matter of fact, ran into a British bomber yard. We discovered that we both were in Dresden that night. He was in the plane and I was down in the bottom. And we finished a bottle of whiskey together there as we exchanged our experiences. Yeah. I wish that you could have been with me and with Bishop Strobel in Dresden at the rededication of the Frauenkirche, of the one church that had been bombed out. And there was a very strong British presence. As a matter of fact, particularly the people in Coventry. Coventry in England was, of course, a very early target of the bombing by the Luftwaffe, by the German Air Force. That was just as cruel and as horrible as the bombing of Dresden. And between Coventry and Dresden, there is now a very strong relationship. And as a matter of fact, the Christians in Coventry took some of the nails from the roof of their cathedral that had been bombed out by the German Luftwaffe, yeah? And they fashioned an altar cross out of these nails, a nail cross, which they then dedicated to the church in Dresden, the Frauenkirche. And as a matter of fact, this nail cross is now a permanent fixture of the altar of that church in Dresden. Most meaningful, I mean, incredibly powerful witness that we received there. And thank you so very much. Here, all the way up front. We have about 10 more minutes and then we really have to start thinking about breaking it up.
Good afternoon. Still not on.
Yes, it is.
Is it? Okay. My name is Virginia Knapp. I wanted to ask you, when all hell broke loose and pure evil descended upon Dresden and the world, what was the justification put out by the American government and the British government for bombing an innocent city? I don't believe I ever read it or know of it.
Well, the military, and please, I'm not against the military. As a matter of fact, I'm serving as a chaplain to one of our veteran organizations here in the city. But the military, whether it's American, English, German, Italian, French, Russian, name it, they will, of course, always have their particular explanation. And they will say it was necessary because there were war objectives. Well, and they put this out again, of course, also in this case. Yeah. And I never accepted that because the evidence doesn't bear it out. We did have, of course, in Dresden also we had some military. We had an airport, we had barracks and all this, but they were on the outside of Dresden. And no bombs fell on those installations. But the bombing was concentrated on the civilian people in the center of the city. That's the visible evidence. These are the facts that speak. And so there's a very good book on the Dresden bombing by Taylor. Frederick Taylor, yeah. February 13, Dresden. Fantastic, written by Elisabeth. I think it's one of the best books, extremely well researched, on the bombing of Dresden. Yeah. Fabulously written. But on that last point, I don't agree with him. Yeah, when he said, well, but after all, there were military objects there. Yeah, there were military objects there, but they weren't hit. So, but other than that, it's a book worth your time. David.
I've got to ask this from a historical perspective. Dresden was not a military town. It was often referred to as the Florence of the Elbe. It was a center of culture, but it was also a center for communication. It was a hub to that part of Germany and into Eastern Europe. One of the justifications for bombing Dresden at that time, the war with Germany was just about over. But as far as the British and the Americans were concerned, at least for some of them, the war with the Soviet Union was about to begin. One of the justifications for destroying Dresden was to keep it out of the hands of the Soviets, so that they would not have a place to step off on a war against the British and the Americans.
David, I give you an A for effort. But you don't convince me.
I'm not trying to convince you. I'm just telling you what I heard.
Now, Jason, I mean, I cannot say this is 100% proven what I'm saying now, but that is the explanation that makes the most sense to me. Dresden was bombed on February 13 to 14. February 13 was Tuesday, February 14 was Ash Wednesday in 1945. About a week before that, the first days of February, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR met in Yalta. That was the great Yalta Conference. And at that time, and also de Gaulle was invited, but de Gaulle was sort of more in the background. At that time, they decided how they would carve up Germany, which was by that time defeated. Who's going to take what part of Germany and what kind of conditions are we going to establish? At that time, Stalin addressed the Western Allies, that's Churchill, and FDR particularly, about contacts that had been made by the German generals and the top military to the Western Allies. Some of the German officers also knew that the war was over. And so they made an offer to the West. We will surrender to you as long as you give us the opportunity to keep fighting the Soviets. Which seemed to make sense to that German intelligence at that time. And it was, of course, FDR, and I respect him for that, who said, no, unconditional surrender, period. And I respect him for that. Yeah? And so nothing came of this. But of course, Stalin, who had his own spies and people and informants, he knew about this. And he said then, there in Yalta, to the Western Allies, you have been bombing West Germany like crazy. Hamburg, Hanover, Cologne, and so forth, the whole bit. You have hardly bombed any of the eastern cities. As a sign of your goodwill, that you're not going to cop out on me in the last minute, I want you guys to bomb one of the eastern cities. I leave it up to you which you want to take. And then the Brits said, well, okay, now we can take Leipzig, we can take Dresden, or what. And somehow it fell on Dresden, and there we got it. That seems to make the most sense to me. Well,
you've been an excellent audience. We appreciate your participation, and especially let's give Manfred a hand.
Well, all I can say is thank you to you, for coming out, and for your interest. I will give the next a real lecture on the second Tuesday in February. That will be February 10th, here on Islamic imperialism, the imperialism of Islam. And so if you want to come, here's the invitation.